Many years ago, I was studying score reading, looking at this page from Mahler's Sixth Symphony. I laboriously went through it, playing each part individually on the piano, then playing various combinations of parts, like all the horn parts, the upper strings, and so on. After a lot of work, I felt I had a good sense of what it should sound like. Then I listened. When I came to the second bar on this page, all the orchestral counterpoint was momentarily drowned out by that cymbal stroke, which I totally overlooked. That taught me an important lesson. What is visually salient is not necessarily the same as what is orally salient. Music is made to be heard. While most people take this for granted, much of the time we spend studying music is given over to score study. This means that we're looking at the music rather than hearing it. While a good music teacher will ask students to sing and/or play from the score, there are limits to what can be done in this regard. We can't sing all the parts in an orchestral score to learn about orchestral balance, and singing in itself doesn't necessarily tell us which lines are more important and audibly salient. Human perception, formed by evolution, is hierarchical. There are always priorities. Nobody can hear all the parts in an orchestral score equally clearly. And in fact, they aren't meant to be equally salient. Even when we listen to dense counterpoint, as in a fugue, at any given moment we're focusing on one part or another. The main difference between a fugue and a song, from the point of view of perception, is that in a song the foreground stays in one place, the singer, and in a fugue it moves around. Since the Western musical tradition is normally polyphonic, a good part of a composer's job has to do with making sure that the right things emerge as foreground. Here's another example. This is a little excerpt I prepared for my applied orchestration course. It illustrates a frequent student error, making an insignificant part stand out through contrast. The arco line in Violin 2 is of no particular interest, and setting off by contrast from the other parts, pizzicato, just emphasizes its insignificance. But there's another problem here. Listen again to see if you can hear it. Okay, now look carefully at the score, specifically at the part writing between the cellos and violas in the second complete measure. You may notice those parallel fifths, B flat to F, going to C to G. Those fifths are visually quite obvious, but audibly, given the foreground contrast between the arco and the pizz, I would not have noticed them at all, even after repeated listening. These two examples teach us something very important. When we're studying music, we have to constantly verify our observations through listening. And when we should compose for the ear, not for the eye. It is true that not all listeners are equal. A well-trained musician will certainly notice things that a beginner will not. But there are still limits. There are some things that even an experienced musician simply can't hear. This is easy to prove. Try for a while to analyze music just by ear, not using the score. Even with multiple listening, certain things just pass unnoticed, things that you may notice very quickly with the score. Conversely, some of the things that stick out the most, orally, may not be visually salient at all, as in my Mahler example above. There are also different degrees of oral salience. Let's compare these three examples. Learning strict counterpoint, all these examples of parallel fifths would be strictly forbidden. But this makes no sense. What's really striking here is the difference between these examples. In the first, the fifths on the downbeats are blatant. In the second, they're more subtle, since the line's pattern changes. In the third, the parallels are pretty much unnoticeable, since the suspension of the bass part attracts our attention and enriches the whole. What a good counterpoint teacher should do here is to point out the different degrees of salience and explain why they have the effect they do. This is much more useful to an apprentice composer than a black and white interdiction. Counterpoint, harmony, orchestration, and analysis, well taught, should all be seen as ear training, sensitizing the student to subtle distinctions in what we hear. For a composer, it's essential to concentrate on what is audibly salient. This might seem obvious, but there are systems of musical composition proposed in the 20th century that are based on procedures that are totally inaudible. While it is true that sometimes chance or some mathematical procedure may suggest an interesting idea you would not have thought of otherwise, that does not mean that everything generated from these procedures will automatically be musically interesting or coherent. You always need to make the final decision by ear. Similarly, the fact that all the material in a musical work may somehow be derived from the same idea does not in itself ensure audible coherence. Our perception of a musical work is very different from the way we look at a painting. Music takes place over time, whereas we can take in a visual scene at one glance. This means that, all other things being equal, related moments that are far apart in time not automatically evoke each other, unless the composer does something specifically to highlight the connection. If the composer does not somehow underline the old idea when it comes back, the listener will simply not notice. Further, not all moments in a piece are equally salient. Beginnings, endings, major contrasts, and climaxes are the things that naturally remain in our memories. A composer may direct our attention to another moment, say by a dramatic pause before it or with a crescendo leading up to it. Without this kind of pointing finger, don't expect the listener to notice all those distant connections. So when, in an analysis course, the focus is on some motivic derivation 200 bars apart, ask yourself if anybody would really notice it when listening to the piece. Not all analytic observations are equally important. Make sure you always classify them in terms of salience. The student composer can learn a great deal in this way about where to put the most effort while working on a piece. In fact, there's a lot to be said for starting any analysis without the score, just listening multiple times, taking note of what strikes you most prominently. So the point of this lesson is, in music, when in doubt, trust your ears.